Good evening. I'm RDA Vice President Lonnie Hugboom, and on behalf of the Rise Design Alliance, I welcome you to the third lecture of our spring series, New Orleans 5 Years After. And welcome to all who are braving this record-setting cold front and rolling blackout. We want to thank the Rice School of Architecture and Dean Sarah Whiting for the continued support of our organization and mission. We're also grateful to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston for the use of this wonderful auditorium. We also want to thank tonight's pre-lecture reception sponsors, D.E. Harvey Builders and Halliburton. Please take a moment and view the list of sponsors for tonight's lecture shown on screen. As a courtesy to our speaker, please silence your cell phones and do not use flash photography. The New Orleans series concludes next week with Alejandra Lillo from GRAFT, who will discuss the Make It Right Foundation's projects in the Lower Ninth Ward. Then on March 9th, our New Orleans focus will shift when we present an RDA Civic Forum featuring County Judge Ed Emmett and Galveston Mayor Joe Jaworski, who will discuss our regional emergency preparedness and response plans in light of our recent history with Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Ike. In 2 weeks, RDA will present a lecture by Jean-Marie Plinsa in collaboration with the Houston Arts Alliance. Plinsa's sculptures installed on Buffalo Bayou will be dedicated on February 15 at 5 p.m. He will then lecture here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston the following evening, February 16 at 7 p.m. RDA's spring programs continue in April with the annual architecture tour, Houses of Import, which will focus on out-of-town architects working in the Houston area, and then the Sally Walsh lecture featuring petroglyphs from the Netherlands, which will be presented by the RDA, the Rice School of Architecture, and the Architecture Center of Houston Foundation. For more information on all of RDA's future programs, please see our RDA website at www.risedesignalliance.org. Before we welcome tonight's speaker, I'd like to share a few comments regarding the series. Like many of you in the audience, I have personal deep connections to New Orleans as my wife is a native, and we visit back home several times a year. We first returned to post-Katrina New Orleans in February 2006, and it was a heart-wrenching experience to see the devastation. At that point, 6 months after the storm. More so, it was uplifting to see the city, be in the city, especially during that first Mardi Gras, and know the unwavering spirit of the people would indeed bring New Orleans back. In scheduling this series, the RDA Programs Committee intentionally set it for slightly beyond the 5-year anniversary. One, because we anticipated there would be deserved attention surrounding the anniversary, and two, we felt it appropriate to reflect on New Orleans' recovery and rebuilding in a non-hurricane moment when we were all in preparedness mode. So the Hurricane Katrina has taught many of us in the Gulf region and the nation some super hard lessons, and we are still learning. As we will this evening with one of New Orleans' best teachers, architect and planner, Ray Manning. About 8 months ago, while we were doing our due diligence on selecting speakers, I spoke with the city planner of New Orleans to obtain some feedback on our short list. That official's advice to me, "Oh, Ray, you've got to invite him. These past 5 years, the architect in New Orleans who has made the difference is Ray. You can't go wrong inviting New Orleans' favorite son to speak at your lecture." Ray Manning holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Southern University and a Master of Architecture from the University of Michigan, Tubman College of Architecture and Planning, with continued education in design and management from Harvard University and Dartmouth College. Mr. Manning devoted his master's thesis to his involvement in planning Detroit's neighborhoods, which at the time were already feeling the effects of that city's economic decline. Ray Manning serves as president and CEO of his eponymous firm, Manning Architects, based in New Orleans with a satellite office in Dallas. During the past 25 years, Mr. Manning's creative leadership has established him and his firm with regional and national reputation in architecture, interior design, urban design, and planning. The core of Manning's work is focused on the development, planning, and urban design of New Orleans before and after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. In post-Katrina New Orleans, Mr. Manning is responsible for leading the Bring New Orleans Back, or BNOB, the neighborhood recovery planning process, which ultimately led to the funding and organizational structure of the Unified New Orleans Plan, or UNOP, the city's official recovery plan. Along the way, Mr. Manning led and participated in numerous efforts to reinvigorate and restore the city. Most notable, his current work is for the New Orleans Master Plan, the city's official development plan, which was recently awarded the prestigious American Planning Association's National Planning Excellence Award for a hard-won victory. And then a few of the other urban design and planning efforts which are contributing to the ongoing transformation of New Orleans include Mr. Manning's involvement with the New Orleans Union Passenger Terminal Multimodal Master Plan, the Regional Planning Commission Feasibility Study for the Andrew Higgins Pedestrian Access Plan, and the Regional Transit Authority Streetcar Extension Program. The civic and design leadership which Ray demonstrates and lives on a daily basis has made him a sought-after speaker. He regularly participates as a lecturer and panelist at national and international conferences and events on issues related to urban design, neighborhood development, community outreach, sustainability, urban water management, and disaster and recovery planning. Some of his most significant civil roles include the New Orleans Business Council and a recent appointment to the New Orleans Board of Liquidation and the New Orleans Sewerage and Water Board by the newly elected Mayor Mitch Landrieu. He currently serves as the president-elect of the New Orleans chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And as of this past Thursday, I'm happy to announce on the slide to this audience before AIA has made their formal press releases, Mr. Manning has been elevated to the College of Fellows and will be invested this May at the National AIA Convention in his hometown of New Orleans. With that impressive background, please join me in welcoming Ray Manning.
Lonnie, thank you so much for that warm and probably more detailed resume than I've heard. When I got the letter to inviting me to speak in this series, I actually had to flip it over and make sure that it was in fact addressed to me, because I quite honestly thought there was a lot of serendipity involved, and it was kind of a woo-woo moment for me because of what I'm about to tell you. And before I go on, I just want to again thank the board of the Rice Design Alliance for inviting me, and Lonnie, who took me to a great dinner last night, and I had some Houston-style gumbo. So I was impressed, actually, and so ironic. We ran into a friend of mine, a lawyer friend of mine, who was celebrating, I guess, a hard-won case, and they were sitting right next door to the table to us, and I thought how small the world is, and tonight there are friends in the audience, people I've known for almost 30 years now, and then some of their children are in fact here. Melvin, some friends who no longer live in New Orleans, but their daughter is here tonight, and I just want to say hello to her. My Katrina experience actually started on August 4th. I was flying back from Miami, and I picked up, as I often do, a stack of magazines, and I was just going to sort of flip through them, throw them away as I got off the plane. In Gentleman's Quarterly of that year, August 2005, there was a small article actually written by a Texan, Jim Atkinson. It was entitled 5 Health Tests That Could Save Your Life. I was going to have a physical in the next week, and so I called my office and said, you know, I want to have a CT scan. And as a result of that, on August 4th, I was diagnosed with a tumor on my left kidney. And that set off a whole series of events. Now remember, this is August 4th. I'm then scheduled for surgery on September 2nd, 2005. And I was supposed to see the anesthesiologist on August 29th, 2005. Obviously, I was in a caravan of New Orleanians driving to Houston that Sunday before with no medical records, a duffel bag with shorts and flip-flops, thinking that we just go away for a few days, let this hurricane pass, and head on back to New Orleans. In fact, the morning I woke up after that 18-hour caravan, my immediate thought was I didn't want to be caught in that, so I was going to drive back the next morning. I got to Lake Charles and found out, well, the levees have been breached and the city is flooded, or is flooding. I'm left now with the possibility of, no surgery, which was starting to get a little troublesome given the fact that I wanted whatever was inside of me out. And we then went on to Lake Charles, stayed there for a few days, got a referral to MD Anderson, came back to Houston on August 8th, saw the doctor on the 9th. He scheduled me for surgery on the 13th, and I went to MD Anderson and had a surgery which I'm happy to report 5 years later I'm cancer-free, and very grateful to the doctors and the staff at MD Anderson. But during the time that I was in the hospital, I was doing 24/7 CNN and watching the city that I loved underwater. The facts of that story are probably only important to me, but it also says a lot about Houston. In fact, over 1,000 cancer patients were treated at MD Anderson during that period. And since May, every May since that time, MD Anderson has come to New Orleans and had a luncheon for all the people who were treated at that time. So I'm here tonight, one, to thank Houston for all that you did during that time, and also particularly to thank the staff and physicians and the great organization that MD Anderson is. They saved my life. So that is... So having had surgery, and then Rita hits Houston. So now I'm a week out of the hospital. The doctor says two things. One, don't drive. Two, avoid secondhand smoke. I'm now driving to Dallas for 12 hours and watching your evacuation process. And I have to say, not so good. But we made it to Dallas, hopped a plane to Chicago, from Chicago to Hartford, and I spent the next couple of weeks in a gentleman, a friend's home in Oline, Connecticut, recovering, and all at the same time being very anxious to get back to New Orleans, although at that time, we were dewatering the city and there was no possibility of getting back into the city. So, with that in mind, I understand great speakers will always start a presentation with a joke. So, I never do this, but I thought, well, I tell you that story about the surgery and the cancer, so let's sort of try to have a light moment. An engineer and an architect and a planner are standing at the pearly gates. God looks at them and says, before I grant you entry into heaven, I must ask you what you believe in. Addressing the engineer, he first asks, what do you believe in, sir? The engineer looks at God with an eye and passionately says, I believe engineering is the best of all sciences and professions, and we do good for all. Nothing else brings such unbridled joy to so many people, from the slums of Rio to the bright lights of Barcelona. I've devoted my life to bring joy to people through good engineering. God looks at him and says, come on in. He then turns to the architect and says, "You, my son, what do you believe in?" The architect stands proud and says, "I believe that good art and good design are fundamental to an enjoyable life, and I spent my whole career asking and seeking to be a living embodiment of the quest of the best of these things." God says, "Come on in." He turns to the planner, says, "You're a planner. What do you believe in?" The planner looks at God and he says, "I believe you're in my seat." Actually, I have a great deal of admiration for planners and architects and engineers, and they have worked mightily in the 5 years since the storm, and my involvement in the recovery, planning, and ultimately an establishment of a vision for New Orleans has been it's been a challenging undertaking. But hundreds of citizens, thousands of them in fact, have worked tirelessly to create the city, to recreate the city that we love. My involvement in the neighborhood planning process and the efforts of the city to rebuild itself have been not the work that I would have chosen, but work nonetheless that, based upon the events of 2005, was work that we must and should have done. Hopefully my presentation tonight will lead you to understand the hard-earned lessons that we have learned in New Orleans. But I'm going to just sort of try to put, if I can, those events into a global perspective so that those lessons, which we have rightfully earned and are put in a perspective that not only suggests to New Orleans but to the world how the issues of climate change and how to create resilient urban communities which can withstand storm events and natural hazards, and how the economic and global climate shifts will affect economies all over the world. The lessons learned from our collective experience in New Orleans are unique to our topology and our environment and the location of our city at the headwaters of the Mississippi River. At the delta of the Mississippi River. But the systems and environmental elements they involve are global. Increasingly in the 21st century, urban change and urban disaster responsiveness will become an issue that will challenge political leaders, architects, planners, and community organizers around the globe. Think Pakistan, think Haiti, think Brisbane. The question of how do we mitigate disasters through man-made interventions will become, I believe, a discipline of its own. The engineering and design professions that we celebrate today will have to evolve to contemplate these real and present dangers. The question is, how does a city become truly sustainable? How can a city continue to afford basic services in line with shifting settlement patterns, lifestyles, and limited government resources? For New Orleans, Katrina was a catalyst for change, but every city has its own catalyst for change, with commonalities to be found within the solution leading us toward resiliency and sustainability. I'd like to use this presentation as an opportunity to expand the conversation to discuss the anticipated changes and their impacts on 21st century cities around the globe, and then use that framework to discuss some planning strategies and projects I've been involved in New Orleans. This is a slide of New Orleans at 1876. At the time of the settlements of New Orleans, most of it occurred on the edge of the Mississippi, places chosen based on natural contours, based on years of annual floods, and built upon sediment which created the high ground nearest the water's edge. The flooding that occurred as a result of the levee breaches in 2005 followed that contour exactly, which leads to the question, had we simply respected and built and occupied those areas of the city and limited growth beyond those areas, would the flooding of 2005 been as devastating? As we frame that question and look for an answer, let's look at the globe for the patterns of settlement which beset urban New Orleans around the world, from New Orleans to Jakarta. We'll have to answer a variety of questions. How and where to build? Can we disregard the natural environment while at the same time occupying and accommodating larger population shifts? How do cities adapt to change brought on by global economic, industrial, and labor changes? Think Katrina 2005 meets economic collapse of 2007 and Gulf oil spill 2010. These are not the specific events of the future, but the constancy of change, sea level rise, political upheaval in regions which the world depends on for scarce and diminishing resources, are examples of the hyper change we face. 1920-21, an initiative to collect, organize, and understand the effects of population growth on urban business planning and its impact on global communities. 1920-21, founded by Richard Wurman, the founder of the TED Talks and the software developer behind GIS, and a member of the Design Futures Council, of which I'm a member. I met Richard at a conference some years ago, and as we began to talk, I was impressed with the fact of, one, his great humor, but also the fact that he had undertaken this project as a result of moving on from TED, and to create a multimedia initiative that will collect and distribute information through the web and television and print media. The findings will allow people the people who shape cities to understand, create, and assume meaningful frameworks, leadership models that will lead to what we believe will be smarter cities. 19 cities with populations of 20 million people in the 21st century. This interests me for two reasons. One, the idea of collecting this kind of data. And secondly, the project asks the question, what are the issues that might affect the anticipated growth as the population swells in an unprecedented way to cities? In 1940, the city of New Orleans was by population larger than Houston and Atlanta. In those 71 years since then, your city, through a variety of civic, leadership, and a series of business and social decisions, surpassed New Orleans in size and, in fact, has grown to be the fourth largest metropolitan area in the country. And my understanding is that after the 2010 census, you will be the third largest metropolitan area in the U.S. Economic and social and geographic factors limited the growth of New Orleans. And now the results of the 2005 floods further limits its attractiveness to an already skeptical business and investment community. In 1800, less than 3% of the world lived in cities. By 1900s, 150 million people lived in world cities. That number has now surged past 3 billion, and last year reached a tipping point, with more than half of the world's population now residing in cities. By 2050, over 2/3 of the world's population will be living in cities. Humans have become an urban species, cramming into footprints built for much smaller populations. Cities are not currently prepared with the appropriate infrastructure and resources necessary to sustain life in these intensely packed urban hubs. The project looks at environmental issues that will affect growing cities. Those cities, almost all of those cities studied, border oceans and could be affected by potential and projected sea level rise. This impact will shape shipping, global industry, and distribution, issues that are critical to New Orleans and Houston's proximity to the Gulf Coast. There are lessons that we in New Orleans have learned in our rebuilding efforts that can and should inform other Delta and oceanfront cities on the preparedness necessary to react to this sudden change. The opposite is the Shrinking Cities project. The question in the immediate aftermath of Katrina was whether or not the city should in fact be rebuilt. Cities with a changing population and footprint must grapple with issues of financial resource, deployment, and infrastructure resilience, whether they're growing or shrinking. In New Orleans, in the post-Katrina condition, the amount of vacant properties increased to 60,000 throughout the city. With a limited tax base, the Bureau of Governmental Research is asking the question, what is the price of civilization? Can we afford to maintain vast parts of the city when occupancy levels have deteriorated and the tax base is shrinking? Such a dialogue is developing, forcing us to ask the question which we all feared: can New Orleans survive? The Shrinking Cities Project is an initiative by the German Federal Cultural Foundation to conduct an international study and processes which are affecting shrinking cities. This intensive analysis and documentation hopefully will be developing strategies. This map shows the cities that have been shrinking over the past 50 years. The Shrinking Cities Project asks the fundamental question: in the 21st century, the era of industrial growth that began 200 years ago is coming to an end. In particular, climate change, fossil fuel depletion, changes in the service industry, and demographic aging will lead to new forms of urban shrinkage and predictably an increase in the number of cities. Can these cities maintain their viability? Having done my graduate work at the University of Michigan, I'm very familiar with the city of Detroit. Detroit is unique in that its rapid shrinkage deals with suburbanization as well as deindustrialization. After the 1960s, the city expanded and became adrift with its population moving to the suburbs due to the automobile and subsequent increases in population mobility, but also the racial tensions and the riots of 1968. The move of manufacturing facilities to the suburbs increased competition from foreign manufacturers, sent many jobs to other countries, and began the abandonment and consolidation of facilities within the city. The past 50 years have been marked by simultaneous attempts at rebranding itself as well as abandonment. The suburbanization of Detroit has had a range of effects, causing abandonment of property which left 1/3 of the city derelict or abandoned. This spring, the city will engage in a series of meetings and gatherings in which they will ask the fundamental question: should some areas be abandoned totally? Those areas will be deemed less viable, and they have plans not to shrink the city, but rather to start to think about how the deployment of resources will affect those areas and encourage people to move to more viable areas, thus reverting some of that land to farming even. The city would identify those neighborhoods which could become stabilized with a greater amount of resource investment. The city will eliminate services such as garbage pickup, police patrols, road repair from thinly populated neighborhoods, and increase funding to rehabilitate vacant properties and homes in more viable neighborhoods. Officials stress that the footprint won't change, but we have to repurpose portions of the city. The city of Detroit is now a regional suburbia, which begs the question: how do we sustain the city center, and how do we repurpose it in a way which is sustainable? How do we define sustainability? These two images, one, the rooftop gardens of the City Hall in Chicago, and the second one, an example of the kind of growth in abandoned neighborhoods that was occurring even before the city was hit by the floods of 2005. Colin Park asked the question: will Detroit and other shrinking cities, in an article entitled "Shrinking City Detroit," asked the question, will Detroit and other shrinking cities bring a new kind of preservation method, such as the storage of cities, to preserve them at low cost now for timely and advantageous redevelopment in the future? Is immediate demolition or development necessary, or can cultural and other artifacts be viewed as simply ruins and studied and observed? The question is, and we have to ask it from this perspective: do we fear this simply because we have a fear that this is the end of civilization? Since Katrina and Rita, the knowledge base around sustainability, responsible building practice has grown in New Orleans. In her book, Weather of the Future, Heidi Cullen assesses the cities in the United States which are most vulnerable to extreme weather and climate change, New Orleans being one of them. And she says, while New Orleans' levee system is being improved, it does little to deal with an important underlying problem. The frequency and intensity of extreme weather events are expected to increase as a result of global warming in the coming years. And are we prepared for that? Miami, another city on that short list, attracts 10 million visitors to its city annually, creating a $15 billion economic impact. Recent studies suggest that without proper preparation, the city could lose over $300 billion by the end of the century if there is a major catastrophic event there. Miami is about 6 feet above sea level, with a water table almost at surface. But they're taking steps to change that dynamic by implementing a project called Green Print. This initiative commits Miami to a sustainable future, outlining steps to address climate change, reduce greenhouse and gas emissions, and increase renewable energy sources through strong leadership, resource efficiency, transportation, land principles, and economic and community outreach. In this initiative, significant preparation for a disaster is the call of the day. These effects can change the course of cities' development and future, and those plans for disaster can be anticipated, and I believe that we should be learning those lessons from New Orleans. Let's talk about a disaster which would shut off the Gulf of Mexico's oil production, which in turn affected fuel costs in New England and beyond. Let's talk about a hurricane that brought winds of 120 miles an hour, up to 20 inches of rain in parts of southeastern Louisiana and Texas. The storm surged top levees in New Orleans. 500,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Debris teams collect 30 million cubic yards of debris, 237,000 cubic yards of household hazardous waste. More than 1 million residents evacuate, but 300,000 are left behind. The poor lack private transportation and are stranded without viable public emergency transportation occupancies at public buildings all over the city. I'm not describing Hurricane Katrina. It is actually a model, Hurricane Pan, a predictive exercise by FEMA. This image shows on the left the anticipated flood levels from Pan, on the right the actual flood that occurred during Katrina. In July 23, 2004, FEMA released their study of Hurricane Pan, 1 year in advance of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. An exercise using realistic models and weather damage information developed by the National Weather Service, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the LSU Hurricane Center, and other state and federal agencies to help officials develop joint response plans for a catastrophic hurricane in Louisiana. And this was not the first simulation or predictive study. In 2002, the Times-Picayune published a series on the dangers posed to the city by the failure to strengthen our levees. We were constantly in front of Congress asking them to fund an increase in levee protection dollars. And also, as a result of Louisiana coast natural defenses being lost at a football field a day, again in Congress before the storm asking for $14 million to help study and start a process of rebuilding that coastline. This series was awarded the 2003 Excellence in Media Award by the American Society of Engineers. Let's take a minute to let that sink in. 2 years before Katrina, we could anticipate the effects of such an event with almost 100% accuracy. But yet the urgencies of the moment did not change our leadership and our perspective on these events. because we cannot think in the worst case scenario. I've covered a range of research initiatives and projects with very underlying themes. How do we connect this narrative? In the immediate days following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, there were opportunities to give new direction to the city's redevelopment process. These decisions were often not made for lack of coherent leadership and for a lack of an ability to assuage age-old divisions within our community, both racial and economic, which I said earlier have crippled the development of our city and left us in your dust. The New Orleans planning process allowed for and forced us to rethink the way we think of infrastructure systems and the work between public and private sectors to coordinate social and cultural economic synergies. The process of disaster recovery goes from immediate disaster response to mitigation, to resilience and community development. In those days, in late 2005, planning teams had limited resources, worked to engage residents and determine what could be the most effective means of allocating and investing resources throughout this recovering city. The Mayor's Bring New Orleans Back Commission, which began its work in late October 2005. Remember, the city was reopened the 1st of October for residents to return. As co-chair of the Neighborhood Planning Committee, my role was to lead a series of initiatives and planning processes, establish a framework for a larger citywide recovery plan, and to secure funding for the city's official recovery plan. In the end, the funding of that plan was not done by the federal government. It was the Rockefeller Foundation, other philanthropic organizations who funded it. The BNOB plan, as I'll refer to it, was unprecedented in its involvement. It brought together civic and business leaders from all over the city who worked tirelessly to identify issues that were critical to the rebuilding of the city. But due to a lack of governmental leadership, the many volumes of data and vision that were created were never implemented. In fact, it led to a 3-year series of planning process after planning process, where each process identified different issues, assessed viability, and without creating a comprehensive vision for the city. Without any clear implementation and communication strategy, the goals of BNOB were not communicated clearly to the city as a whole. The BNOB plan was reduced to the public outcry in which members of the minority and African American community pointed to the power elite as simply creating a plan to take their real estate, to create real estate development opportunities by declaring their neighborhoods as not viable. In the aftermath of this process, other plans moved forward to focus on the wet areas and other aspects of redevelopment, but without a coherent citywide recovery strategy. These are the covers of some of those studies. I believe that perhaps New Orleans has done more citizen-based, bottoms-up planning than any other city in the country. However, in a 2006 report by researchers at the University of Illinois, they've said, and I quote, "These studies ended up being a bundle of short and long-term public and private projects, the logical results of processes which do not distinguish between planning, governmental responsibility, and visionary concepts. The main initiatives, largely viewed as recovery planning efforts, have been adopted overwhelmingly as discrete projects without a larger framework to direct the appropriate limited resources." The silver lining in all of this is that our citizens created the recovery plan for the city. Through efforts largely motivated by their own desire to recreate their city, they created opportunities for themselves and, in spite of roadblocks, are largely responsible for the grassroots level that is unparalleled, I believe, in the country as a result of a major disaster. One such effort, David Wagner, a local architect who last year himself was elevated to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects, created and began a study which would look at the opportunities to parallel the efforts in the North Sea in Holland and how they might affect the infrastructure development and management in New Orleans. The conversation will be different. We now see major efforts to rebuild the Louisiana coast. That work is well underway, and believe me, today it won't cost $14 million. It will cost a lot more. The Corps of Engineers has now spent an unprecedented amount of money on strengthening the levee systems, but a sustainable system beyond the levee system and beyond the coastline is still not developed for the city of New Orleans. David's approach in largely an unfunded effort, calling upon his own personal net worth and his personal network and his close relationship with our legislative delegation, with major support and facilitation by the Royal Netherlands Embassy in Washington, D.C., Paul Farmer, the American Planning Association, is working with the Dutch National Ministries, seeking to find commonalities based on the challenges of the Netherlands and other Delta cities worldwide. The project utilizes resources of groups such as the Providence of South Holland, the municipalities of Rotterdam and Amsterdam, the Netherlands Institute for Spatial and Planning and Housing universities at Delft, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam, water boards and private engineering and design concerns. Through a series of workshops, we work to embrace Dutch practices and ideas for the innovation and incorporation of waters into our urban fabric in New Orleans. The significance of water to New Orleans is not lost. This map, which shows the Crescent City bounded by Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Bourne. In fact, in 1984, we celebrated water in our 1984 World Exposition entitled The World of Rivers, Fresh Waters as a Source of Life. This graphic shows that interrelationship of water to our urban fabric, but most citizens in New Orleans only think of water when the drainage system is damaged and the streets are flooded. Rotterdam, a city that is synchronized with water, gives us examples of what we might accomplish if we have a very thoughtful and careful conversation about the reintegration of water into our urban fabric. In fact, the slide on the left shows the Carondelet turning basin, a strong and productive canal system made New Orleans a World Trade Center, although the relationship to these canals has changed. The slide on the right is that same area of New Orleans. These images show a site which was a productive canal a century ago and has been developed in a way that increases runoff and burdens our water management system. The U.S. and Dutch teams have worked to identify strategies. In this slide, you'll see actually a man-made island which would act as a buffer in Lake Pontchartrain. Much of the water which came into the city was through a 30-foot tidal surge brought in through that area. These barrier islands, which we could create using Dutch principles, would provide safety and water management and allow us to peacefully coexist based upon values of and increase land adjacency values. These dialogues initiated this idea to transform land using Dutch principles and management. Last week, the Wagner Manning team submitted its application to the Greater New Orleans, Inc., or GNO, a regional and business organization. This organization is funding a $2 million study to create a water management plan for the city. And in Lonnie's introduction, I have now taken the probably unprecedented step of being the first architect to sit on the Board of Liquidation and Board of Liquidation and Debt, but also will have a concurrent seat on the Sewage and Water Board. It is my hope that I will bring some design thinking to this area. It is estimated that we need to spend $5 billion to repair our sewer and water system, which sat under 6 to 10 feet of water for about 2 weeks after the storm. These are renderings which show some of the strategies that could be used. The slide below shows an area of New Orleans called the Hoffman Triangle, and to the right or top of that slide, the first slide, is an area which is underdeveloped. In fact, housing has been demolished on that area. It is our belief that a water management or retention effort could, in fact, save that area, because it is, in fact, at that tip, the lowest point in the city. It is, in fact, where the drainage system pumps water out to the lake. This is an example of what neighborhoods might look like as we incorporate water features into those areas. Over the past 20 years, I've worked extensively on the inventory of buildings and city center projects, public transportation, analyzing demographics, and making recommendations to improve the physical and social conditions of the city. This analysis has been used to, I believe, raise a critical level of thinking around not just the larger infrastructure issues, but also the fine grain of housing, tourism, and transportation needs within the city. In all of these, we seek to determine ways to live, work, and play within this very tightly woven urban environment. HUD's Hope 6 program. I'm going to shift now to a series of projects which happened before the storm and then led to some work that we're currently doing in the city relative to housing. HUD's Hope 6 program, established to promote the fundamental changes in the way public housing was developed and administered, gave a grant to an area which was the St. Thomas. If you're familiar with New Orleans, the Lower Garden District, there was a 49-acre 1930-style public housing project, which was in many ways distressed because of crime, underemployment, and drugs, and all of the things that beset many urban environments across the country. Our work in this project was to redevelop that area and design a set of guidelines that will lead to the redevelopment of this area. Beginning in 2003 and through 2008, we came up with design guidelines and development process that established this as a mixed income community around a large park, which you can see from the slide. As a result, crime has been reduced, and we have a number of the original buildings we have been able to salvage. Prior to Katrina, the city's housing authority had begun work on the city's redevelopment of its Big Four housing projects. After the storm, the city decided to grant approval for the demolition of sound housing stock. The immense public outcry is characterized by this protest, which erupted on the day the council decided to approve that action. Nicholas Ursoff in the New York Times denounced the decision as a human and architectural tragedy of vast proportions. The decision to demolish this housing was based on an age-old division within the community, which viewed the large concentration of poverty and disinvestment around these areas as detrimental to the city's overall economic health. Whether you believe that or not, in fact, we demolished perfectly sound housing that could have brought many of our citizens back from Houston and Atlanta back to their home, New Orleans. How then do you create a vision for revitalizing neighborhoods? We continue to work with HRI, the developer in this case, on a new project. This project is the Agraville housing development, which is located right next door to the French Quarter, adjacent to the city's retail core and Canal Street, and neighbor to Armstrong Park, the city's cultural park. and linked by now a new streetcar line, the Loyola streetcar line, and is next to the neighborhood known as Treme. It is currently home to 465 families, which occupies only 56% of the total site. I've been connected with this neighborhood for about 15 years, having worked on renovations and modifications to it back 15 years ago. The project now, however, we are in a grant process with HUD in which the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, we're competing for a pool of money, I think around $65 million, to help physically change this property and redevelop it into a mixed-use, mixed-income neighborhood. With one exception from the St. Thomas project, we hope that some of the programs around adult education, job training, and retention, family support, intergenerational, and community-based economics will allow this community to thrive, even though today it is home to a large number of single parent households. The neighborhood revitalization in this area, we believe, if we're selected for this this choice grant application process, will allow us to move this $150 million revitalization project forward. Selected buildings will remain, and a variety of new housing types will be introduced, offering a range of housing choices and typologies and style. The units will include affordable, subsidized, and market-rate housing. Most importantly, and one of the things that I've stressed in the redevelopment of this area, is that we will reintegrate this neighborhood into the city's street grid. Presently, a garden-type development of that era separates the city and does not allow the kind of security that most neighborhoods provide simply by having a front door to a street. These changes reflect the indigenous qualities of traditional New Orleans neighborhoods and will ensure, I believe, economic resiliency for generations to come. And all of this is on high ground. In 2005, 2006, we began the task of what we thought was the creation of an iconic central development in the heart of New Orleans, which I believe would give the city a vehicle of hope. Such an iconic facility is no less important than the housing that I just spoke about. In this case, the National Jazz Center complex was to act as a hub for the music industry and jazz and offer much-needed archival space for jazz research. The site is proximate to the Superdome and New Orleans Arena. In working with Tom Main of Morphosis, along with Eskew Dumas and Ripple, Manning was to create this public-private project, which would have been an opportunity for the Pritzker family, who owned the Hyatt Hotel, which you may remember from much of the covers that occurred, the windows blown out, curtains dangling in the wind, was being rebuilt. And Tom, having been a Pritzker Prize awardee, was brought to New Orleans, and we worked with him not only on that project, but also we were hoping to create. We did create an exhibit, which we presented in the Netherlands in 2006. Although this project was not realized, it gave us the opportunity to consider and prioritize the investment of resources in a post-Katrina New Orleans. The National Jazz Center was not high on the hierarchy of immediate needs of the city. But as I speak to you today, this initiative is being reborn by a local developer who is now undertaking the redevelopment of the Hyatt. This, I believe, is significant because even though it wasn't developed in 2006, we now have an opportunity to revisit and perhaps we appropriately size it to its appropriate location. This slide shows, in fact, one of the issues that we continue to confront, and that is a well-organized transportation system which deals with the issues of the metropolitan area's patterns of race and segregation. in disaster planning. The results suggest, in a study from UC Berkeley, that cities facing risks requiring evacuation cannot completely depend on decentralized private evacuation strategies. Prior to Katrina, many individuals in New Orleans, as I mentioned earlier, were without access to public transportation. These low car ownership rates related to segregation, patterns in the city, households without cars are more likely to be poor and minority. In fact, this slide shows even the evacuation routes planned for private automobile evacuation are not always safe. The quote shown on the screen is a statement that I believe, again, characterizes what happens in the event of evacuations. This is a statement from Dr. Maestri, the Emergency Management Director for Jefferson Parish in 2006. Other transit work, which we are undertaking at this time, will deal with some of the issues that are brought on by providing alternative means to the private automobile for those citizens to locations where they can be effectively evacuated. During Hurricanes Gustav, one such facility, the New Orleans Union Passenger Terminal, people were actually bused to that location and removed from the city by use of Amtrak rail cars. The infrastructure for public transportation is crucial to the daily operation of any effectively managed city. From a disaster resilience perspective, an effective transit mobilization plan ensures the evacuation and security of a community. Our current work in transit through a transportation investment generating economic recovery grant, TIGER grant. Our team is developing and identifying alignments for a transit system that will extend our St. Charles streetcar all the way to the Bywater and to the upper Ninth Ward. On the Rampart, this slide shows that entire system. The area in blue is the Loyola streetcar, and the yellow or orange line is the St. Claude streetcar, all linked and hopefully will loop through the downtown area, bringing people all the way to the Union Passenger Terminal project terminal. We've used urban design strategies, looking at different ways of modeling transit stops, all of which is intended to make sure that these structures are integrated into the neighborhoods. These renderings show streetcar stops as models, and in these next set of slides, you see them in the context of the street environment on North Rampart next to the French Quarter and Treme neighborhood. Continuing along the lines, Rampart all the way to Press Street, again to the upper Ninth Ward. This rendering shows the station at Press Street. Finally, as I move to the end, we have been involved in a series of projects recently, one entitled New Orleans Strategic Hospitality Task Force Plan, or the New Orleans Strategic Vision 2018. In 2018, the City of New Orleans will celebrate its 300th anniversary. And we began the process as a pro bono effort to help the city to imagine how to create new and specific projects which will link downtown and some of its tourism attractions so to increase visitor count. Before the storm, New Orleans had about 11 million visitors per year. As of this date, we have about 8 million visitors. The strategies in this particular proposal are designed to help create attractions that will bring visitors back to the city. Included in it is a series of projects at the river's edge, which also helps to link another project which we've been involved in, which is the Reinventing the Crescent project. That project, which was undertaken by the New Orleans Building Corporation, where Chang Krieger, Hargroves Associates, 10 Architectonists, and Eskew Dumez and Ripple have designed a 5-mile stretch of riverfront, which we believe will have a significant impact on the visitor attractions to the city. But these are not done in a vacuum. This map, overlaid with the Unified New Orleans Plan, helps to identify and demonstrate coordinated efforts which will allow the city to bring its citizens closer to the water's edge. The study, the master plan of the city of New Orleans, a plan for the 21st century undertaken by Goody Clancy, Manning as a consultant to that team, is building on the recovery and building plans that I've spoken about, but sets a long-term vision for the future of the city, along with a zoning code to implement those changes. The process of achieving that plan was literally taking all of the previous plans, creating a computer model which allowed us to look at all of the significant projects which were developed in those plans, and then distilling those, and through a series of citywide meetings, we were able to get community input into that process. This culmination of efforts, beginning from November 2005, with studies by APA, AIA, ULI, Bring New Orleans Back, Lambert Plan, ES14, and UNOP, were culminated in the development of the plan for the 21st century plan for New Orleans. In our work, we looked at every neighborhood in terms of its own character, and that will be used by the writers of the zoning code to help implement broad-based land use categories and principles which will will become a framework for decision-making by the City Planning Commission and the City Council. As we work with a number of communities' efforts to propose solutions for the city, consistent with its historic, physical, and cultural and social identity, we have authored strategies for both private and public sector development. In conclusion, the integration of these urban systems, initiatives, and projects are designed to create a new, more livable and walkable New Orleans, which is resilient, prosperous, and sustainable. This long-term integrated city approach for balanced growth begins to answer some of the questions that I posed as I set out tonight. The efforts of the last 5 years to establish the culture of planning in the city cannot be changed. The citizens have been given voice, and they will direct their future. Each of the described planning efforts here have led us closer to a city which is more sustainable, resilient, and importantly, will allow New Orleans to continue to matter in the context of the world and in the United States, and hopefully become a leader in the 21st century as a center for the study of disaster and emergency preparedness. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to let you ask me questions. And I can't.
Yeah, they can't hear you.
Okay.
Any questions?
And I'm supposed to not be concerned if you don't. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on the development along the river down from the corridor that we've been hearing a lot about, but as we walk there, we can't seem to find anything?
Yeah. It is part of the problem of the way the system works in New Orleans. You have a levee wall, you have railroad tracks, and then you have a wharf. And so the area that's just gotten under construction, which is I would say downriver of the French Quarter, is probably going to be the area that's going to have the most opportunity for direct physical access. Because of the urbanization of the area in the central part of the city, it'll be more difficult to do, but that'll, I think, pick up once you get past the convention center, where we're currently planning another public access to the river. So I would imagine that in 2 to 3 years, you'll be able to come to New Orleans and have the opportunity to go from, let's say, the French Quarter, either by streetcar or by bicycle from at least the French Quarter down to the Industrial Canal and back up to the convention center and to what is being developed now as an old power plant into a new retail development center. politically loaded, but a good question. You know, when we, in New Orleans, when we look at the north of the lake, I give you a couple of examples of how I think we've attempted over the last 15 years to connect north of the lake. Obviously, there's a causeway, which is the primary way that bedroom community comes into New Orleans. We've done at least 2 studies. One of them was a maglev structure or system, which would have been a high-speed rail link that would have brought citizens across the lake. But after the storm, everybody kind of went into their nest and started to look at themselves independently of one another. Across the lake, because they had been a very fast-growing community, they decided that along with Baton Rouge, or East Baton Rouge Parish, they were going to create the kind of anti-New Orleans approach to southeast Louisiana. In some ways that's changed, but in many ways it still persists because many of the decisions made by the governor's office, as an example, to turn down $300 million in stimulus money, which would have actually created a rail link between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, was the kind of decision that is made in a very partisan political environment, or at least a governor who thinks that he can run for president. That's a very long-winded answer to say that there's not been a lot of regional cooperation. That's changed because we are, in fact, on the same polder, as they say in the Netherlands, because we're part of the same water region. And so we're sort of forced to have to work together. My family is from Washington Parish, which is one parish above St. Tammany, and so I'm through that parish all the time. And because of their lack of planning, because of their lack of transportation planning, they are having now the same kinds of problems that beset any ring city as they continue to build Walmarts and Best Buys and with very little thought about zoning and planning. Yes, ma'am.
I love the idea of incorporating the waterways.
Yes.
And I'm curious, I mean, it seems like it'd be incredibly difficult, but it seems like it makes a lot of sense. I'm just curious what the general response is.
Well, yeah, it's a good question. New Orleans, if you come to the city, you'll pass canals all over the place. They're just not very attractive. Mm-hmm. You know, the Xavier University, a university I do some work at, in front of its administration building is a canal. It's a concrete open box. And if we're doing that project today, we look at it in a very different way. There are lots of open canals in New Orleans East, parts of the city that are much more suburban. And so I think the struggle is going to be whether or not people will accept the fact that we might try to enhance those canals as opposed to simply covering them up. There are many streets in New Orleans, Canal Street, Rampart Streets, which has underground canals, which we've covered, and I showed you one of those slides. That canal is still there. It's just covered up. And so I think we have to just go back and look at the issues from a different perspective, and hopefully our Dutch colleagues and the work that we've already begun with them. I think people come to meetings like this. When we did the Dutch dialogues, we've done 4 of them now, and they come and they see the slides and they get excited about it. And so I think, except for those folks who say, well, you're just going to have more mosquitoes, which is true, but again, we've dealt with that issue over time anyway. So that's, I think it can be an exciting opportunity for the city.
So it's not adding more waterways, it's just enhancing.
Enhancing the ones that we have, and also, in the one slide that I showed you, maybe we have to look at some redoing some very large vacant areas. As I said, we have 60,000 vacant properties in the city, and so we have a lot of vacant land which we could look at in a very different way. Yes.
Is there any plan with where the LSU's proposed hospital is going to be in the lower mid-city? Are they planning any sort of mitigation for the runoff for all the parking lot that's going to be there?
Yeah, a very unfortunate planning decision. Someone, as I was preparing this, someone was telling me about the way that decision was made to locate those hospitals in that area. Does anybody